And in verse 6, Galatians chapter 3, beginning in verse 6, Paul has a lot to say about the faith of Abraham. And he says this regarding Abraham's faith. He says, just as Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. So then those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. Now, these few verses here could be the substance of our class this morning, but we're just going to pull a couple of things out of them. First of all, in verse 6, you notice that Paul recounts the words of Moses saying that Abraham was counted as righteous by God because of his what? Because he was counted as righteous by God because of his faith. Then we go down and we see that those who are of faith, in verse 9, we see that those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. And what we're seeing here, I think what I want to pull from this is that Abraham has the kind of faith that we should all be aspiring to. When people would brag, when Jewish Christians would brag about being physically descended from Abraham, what they got, the message they got in return was, your physical descent from Abraham is not really what matters. What matters is that you have faith like Abraham's faith. And this morning we're going to get a pretty good snapshot of what it means to have faith like Abraham's faith. And so we're going to try to go through and see what exactly is so great about Abraham's faith and how can we have a faith like his. Yes?
I think his faith sticks out because of his obedience.
Exactly, and that's what we'll come to. We'll kind of sum this up again. James is going to describe Abraham's faith. He's going to tell us, here's what's so great about Abraham's faith. It's faith that leads him to obey, and that's exactly it. The kind of faith that God counts as righteousness is the kind of faith that says, God, I trust you enough to do whatever you ask me to do, no matter what it is. And that's we're kind of jumping to the end, but that's what we're going to see quite clearly. Now here's something else. Again, in the New Testament, Colossians chapter 2, beginning in verse 16. Colossians chapter 2, beginning in verse 16. Paul says, therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath, all of these things being ritual ceremonies, so to speak, that were established in the Old Testament. And he says in verse 17, he says, these are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. And so you see what Paul is saying there. He's saying there are so many things in the Old Testament that are shadows of things to come. Specifically, what are these Old Testament elements foreshadowing? He says, these Old Testament things are shadows, but the substance, what's casting the shadow is Christ. Yeah. And this morning, as we go through this passage, I think we're going to see that there are a lot of foreshadowings of Jesus, and they're pretty fascinating to look at. You've heard it said, a mark of the Bible's inspiration is the fact that all of these men who didn't know each other, lived in different eras, they wrote all of these books, and then you put them all together and they fit like pieces of a puzzle, and you're thinking, for this really to work out so well, these guys should have been collaborating. They should have known each other and they should have discussed it. Obviously they didn't, and so the only way to reconcile that is to say there's some overseeing force throughout it all, and it's the Holy Spirit's inspiration. We're going to see some compelling marks of that inspiration in this morning's passage. Okay, now we've talked about where we're going, so let's jump in. Genesis chapter 22, beginning in verse 1, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. And he said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Okay, again, 2 verses here, but 2 verses that are chock full of discussion points, and so we're going to take a little bit of time unloading them. The first thing we notice is that after these things, God did what to Abraham? God tested Abraham. Yes, God tested Abraham. Now, let's be clear. God tested Abraham. God did not do what? God did not tempt Abraham. That's right. James, as a matter of fact, clarifies that point. James chapter 1, in verse 13, James says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for no one can be, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." All right, so God's not tempting Abraham. But here's a discussion question to throw out. What's the difference then? What's the difference between situations when, who's the tempter? Satan, yeah. What's the difference between a situation where Satan tempts us and God tests us? Why are those not one and the same? Obviously there is a difference, but what is that difference?
Well, with God, He gives us the strength to resist the temptation. Being tempted itself is not sin. Giving in to temptation is a sin.
Absolutely. Being tempted is not a sin. Jesus was tempted. Yes?
If we're not tested, there's never any measurement of our love to God or our obedience to God.
That's right. We can't really know what we're made of unless we go through some testing. That's certainly an important part of it. I see faces with thoughts or... Let me throw something out at you here. Let's first of all talk about what... I think we all know what tempting... the purpose of tempting. In 1 Peter 5, verse 8, very well-known verse, 1 Peter 5, verse 8, Peter warns us about Satan, and he likens Satan to, I don't guess Fossil Rim has any lions. No, they probably just have mostly the herbivores. But he warns us, he says Satan is like a lion. And he says, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to do what? To devour. And when Satan seeks to devour you, what's he trying to do? He's trying to get you to turn to him. He's trying to get you to stumble, to fall, to sin. All right? Same thing in beg your pardon? He wants you to lose your soul. He knows where he's going. He knows he has punishment and he's bitter and if he can't have heaven, he doesn't want anybody else to have it. And so he wants us to go down with him.
Just my view on temptation and testing. Temptation is usually to get us to do something that we shouldn't do or being disobedient to God.
Right.
Being tested is just the opposite, to see how obedient we are to God and doing His will.
Right. And that's exactly correct, and I agree. And we'll kind of give some verification on that here in a moment. But in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 5, Paul, and I'll kind of cut to the chase here, Paul says, don't deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again in the sense of the marital relationship, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so it's pretty clear there. Satan wants to tempt anybody he can, whether it's married couples or whoever it might be, to get them to sin, like Jerry, right? Jerry was saying. Okay. On the other hand, testing. In Exodus chapter 20, one of the more fascinating passages in the Bible, in Exodus chapter 20, that's where God has given the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai. And what we find out if we read a parallel passage in Deuteronomy, we find out that when God first gives the Ten Commandments, He's speaking them to all Israel. And you can imagine, here's Mount Sinai that's essentially, the phenomenon is a volcanic eruption there. You've got the smoke and the fire. You've got the sound of trumpets, fumaroles, which are ejecting gas through cracks in the side of the mountain. You have lightning and thunder, which occur with volcanic eruptions. And from this phenomenon, God's voice is thundering and booming, and He's speaking the Ten Commandments. And you find out that the people of Israel hear this, and they're utterly terrified, and they think, surely I can't experience this and live. And that's what you see here in Exodus 20, verse 18. Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled and stood far off and said to Moses, You speak to us. You be the go-between. You get this information from God and you relay it to us. You speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die. Now here's where we're going with this. Verse 20, Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. So here it's stated right there, God has come to test you that you may not sin. So there's the difference. When Satan tempts us, he's trying to get us to fall. When God tests us, he's trying to build strength and character in us. He's trying to put us through the fire and refine us and make us better. He's trying to keep us from sinning. So opposite objectives. Then, so God has come to test Abraham, and he has said, Abraham, Abraham, and Abraham responds, and he says, here I am, or here am I. Interesting aside here, in Exodus 3, verse 4, when the angel of the Lord speaks to Moses out of the burning bush, Moses turns and says pretty much the same thing, here I am. And in the middle of the night, when God speaks to Samuel, the boy Samuel, who is not yet the prophet, he says, again, here I am. And in all of these cases, you see a willingness to turn on a dime and change the course of their lives to follow God's leading. And I think it's important that no matter how set we think our plans are, when we see God's leading, we need to be ready to put our plans aside and follow wherever God takes us. We need to have that flexibility in our lives. Yes?
If not, don't we kind of limit God?
Right.
Kind of testing him, if we're not, when he tests us, if we don't be obedient and do what he's testing us with, don't we limit him and what he can do for us?
We don't limit God, but we limit what he can do through us. Absolutely. Yeah, God will accomplish his objectives.
What he's doing.
Right. And really, we're not hurting God, we're hurting ourselves. God will accomplish his will in one way or another, but we're missing out. And Moses certainly, he said, here I am, and he balked a little bit. He talked about his limitations, but of course, God's not limited by any shortcomings of ours. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We live beneath our privilege when we don't have that willingness to turn on the dime and follow God wherever he leads. And he says, I want you to offer, he doesn't just say, I want you to offer your son. He says, I want you to offer your only son, Isaac, whom you love. And so what's God acknowledging here? He's acknowledging what about what he's asking? The profound significance the profound difficulty of what Abraham is going to have to do. God is saying, I know this is no small thing. Think about this. How long did Abraham wait for that son? He was how old when Isaac was born? He was 100 years old when Isaac was born. He was first promised that son by God when he was 75. So 25 years before that. And now Isaac at this point is probably he's probably an adolescent, probably around 14 or 15 years old. So Abraham would have close to 40 years invested from the time he first heard about that boy. It's 40 years down the line now, and so it's going to be hard for Abraham to do what he's asked to do. Now here's something else that's intriguing. It's at least an intriguing possibility. Notice what God says. He says, I want you to take your son to what place? To the land of Moriah. And then he says, I want you to go to a mountain that I will show you in the land of Moriah. And what we'll find out is that's a 3 days journey. Now, if you get in your car and drive 3 days, you can be on the other side of the country. So that's a pretty significant journey. Seems like God could have said, go over to the next hill and offer your son. But why is he saying this?
This doesn't pertain to that, but some just hit me in the head. Abraham did have another son, but he was through a servant woman, and so it is significant that he would offer Isaac, his son, that God gave him through Sarah.
Sure.
The son which he loved. His other son, we never really see that love that he had for Isaac. Now he did want to take care of him.
Sure.
But it wasn't the same thing.
But this is the son of the promise. And Paul in Romans does a big contrast on Isaac, the son of the promise, versus Ishmael. And so he loved that boy, but this boy, this is at another level of significance for Abraham. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The particular hill was a test.
Mm-hmm.
Noah used it one It's following what he says.
Right? But here's what's interesting. When God gives us specific reasons for his obedience, when God tells us to obey in a specific way, we may not know why, but we're called to obey anyway. The dimensions of the ark, Noah couldn't know at the time, but the dimensions of the ark conform very much to the modern dimensions that would be used to build a very effective and functional ship. And those were things that weren't known at that time. But God has his reasons. He didn't know the explanation to Noah. But here's an intriguing possibility. I would suggest this to you. I don't want to be dogmatic about it, but if you go to 2 Chronicles, chapter 3, verse 1, now remember, David wanted to build a temple for God, but God said, I appreciate your willingness to do this, but you won't build the temple. Who will? Your son Solomon. And in 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1, you see Solomon carrying out that plan, again, according to God's specifications. And then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. Where? If anybody's at that passage, on what mountain? On Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father at the place that David had appointed on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And so jump back, and God is telling Abraham to go 3 days' journey to the region of Moriah, to a specific mountain. And so seems like an intriguing possibility, at least, that a number of scholars have entertained that God may have been leading Abraham where? To the location of what? The future temple of Jerusalem. And this is pretty fascinating because Moses never entered the Promised Land. He wouldn't have known anything about, in a first-hand way, the location of that temple in Jerusalem. So he's writing something here that connects with what later writers would come up with. There's no way for him to have done that through first-hand knowledge. It's a coordinating mark of the Holy Spirit's oversight, as I see it. All right. And you think about what's happening here that also makes that significant. Abraham is going to go to the top of this mountain and do what with Isaac? Offer his only son in a way that is reminiscent of God offering his only son. There are a lot of parallels. And think about what the Levitical priests would be doing at the Temple of Jerusalem, offering sacrifices that also are foreshadowings. We know that for a fact. Read Hebrews. Those offerings are foreshadowings of Jesus' offering. And so you see this connectivity and this symbolism that matches and coordinates in an uncanny way. God says, I want you to offer your son as what kind of an offering? As a burnt offering. And a burnt offering, generally speaking, there are a number of different offerings, but a burnt offering is one that is wholly consumed by fire. Now, some later on in Leviticus, oh yes?
I hate to keep interrupting.
Oh, no.
But burnt offering, the offering has to be dead. It has to die.
Right.
Was it not Solomon, but Sam, the one that the lady had gone and wept to the priest and because she didn't have a child and the name come to me.
Oh yeah, it was what's Samuel's? Hannah. Yeah.
But anyway, she asked for a child and he prayed and she had a child and she gave him back as an offering to God, but he was not a burnt offering, he was a live offering.
Exactly.
So there is a big difference in offering.
Sure. And there were all kinds of offerings prescribed later in Leviticus by Moses, and some would be, the burnt offering was wholly consumed by fire, and other offerings there was part of the animal would be consumed, and maybe the rest of it would be eaten by the priest, and so forth. But in this instance, if you read the description of the burnt offering, and that was written later by Moses, and in Leviticus 1 verse 9, you see that all of that offering was burnt on the altar, and two, and this wasn't always true of these offerings, two, that smoke rising up was what kind of an aroma to the Lord? A sweet, a pleasing aroma rising up to the Lord, yes. And in this instance, you think about the symbolism of a burnt offering. It represented what? When you made that burnt offering to God, it wasn't to atone for a sin, it was to convey what? You're giving what message to God? It's a form of worship that says complete dedication and commitment to God. You're giving 100% of that animal, and likewise I want to give 100% of myself to you. Jesus said the most important commandment in all of the Bible in Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40, the most important commandment is to love God how? With all your heart and your soul and your mind, with everything you have.
And being a burnt offering like that, there's no misconstruing. Like when they did part of the sacrifice and the priest ate the rest, there was an argument there. There was not that argument when it was a burnt offering. Everything was burnt and offered up to God. There was no argument after. That was like a more pure.
Exactly. Yeah. Probably God would rather have our complete dedication than to have a sin atoned for. So you can't get much better than that. And sure enough, what is Abraham going to be representing here when he's willing to bring that knife down on his son and burn his son? That's the essence of what a burnt offering represents, is that complete and total dedication to God. Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. And on the 3rd day, 3 days' journey to get to this place, on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Now, think about this fact. Think about the fact that when you have an unpleasant task and you dread it, you generally, if you can, you put it off, right? You're thinking, okay, I'll get around to it. It's kind of like starting that diet that you don't want to start. You put off the unpleasant things. But what do you see here Moses, or what do you see Abraham doing? God says, offer your son, and the next morning, early, maybe before sunrise, off he goes. And so what do you see? We said we're going to learn about the faith that pleases God, and it's obedient faith, but what's also true of that obedience? It's not dilly-dallying obedience, it's prompt obedience. You perceive the will of the Lord, and you don't put it off. You get right to it, no hesitation. Didn't Jesus say, if you've wronged your brother, you're at the altar, leave your offering behind, and go take care of that problem. Don't let the sun set on it. Yeah, you see what you need to do it right then and there. So prompt obedience. All right. Verse 5. Then Abraham said to his young men, now here's, again, fascinating stuff. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. They've traveled to the foot of this mountain, and they've got the final ascent. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and we will come back to you. Now, why in the world would Abraham say, we'll worship and we'll come back to you? How can you make sense of that? Is he saying, I'm going to bring him back in an ash bucket? No. He had faith that somehow God was going to keep his promise and still make a nation out of that boy. And in fact, the writer of Hebrews reads Abraham's mind for us by inspiration and tells us exactly what Abraham's thinking. In Hebrews 11, verse 17, Hebrews 11:17, Abraham says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So that was what Abraham is thinking. He's thinking, okay, God promised to make a nation of this boy, so that must mean, I know he's not going to go back on his word, somehow he's going to raise him from the dead. And keep in mind, there are no resurrections that we have recorded at this point, so Abraham didn't have a precedent to look back on. It's remarkable faith. Now, here's a contrast. What we'll see earlier, Abraham, as a 114-year-old man, it had taken a while for his faith to reach this point. He didn't grow to this point overnight. Previously, we see Abraham looking at circumstances and looking at God's promises and acting more based on circumstances than on God's promises. But here we see a radical shift in the other direction. And that's what we need to be working toward too. We need to have lives that don't make sense based on circumstances, but that make sense based on God's promises. So that's where Abraham's going here. Verse 6. Yes. His faith was confirmed, and will through his obedience, and the angel of the Lord will pronounce that confirmation later. And Abraham, when is class over?
It's over 15 after.
15 after, okay.
12 and 10 after, and then 1 and 15 after.
Okay, we might be able to get through this here. All right, we'll see. Verse 6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and notice this, he laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so they went, both of them, together. Now, several things here. One, it's just a historical aside. Yeah, Abraham's carrying the fire. What I've read is kind of cool. Maybe he had like a clamshell with glowing embers encased in the two halves from the night before. He would have carried it in a leather pouch, kind of a fire pouch, which is a handy way that you would have been able to build a campfire every night while you were camping. But notice what's going on here. One, who's carrying the wood? Isaac, and it's probably not a small amount of wood that he's carrying. It's probably a decent amount. And there are a couple of things from this. One, what did Jesus have to do as he was walking to the place where he was crucified? He had to carry his own cross, so maybe there's a foreshadowing there. But this tells us a little something about Isaac, too. You think a 4-year-old boy would be doing this? No. He's probably a pretty stout young man to be able to carry this wood up a relatively steep ascent to get to the top of the mountain here. And that, I think, is going to be significant as we go along. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father, and he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them, together. Now, if you jump forward to verse 13, what happens? Abraham doesn't have to offer his son, and instead, what's caught in a thicket? A ram, a grown-up boy sheep. And that is true, that God does provide for the offering, but what does Abraham say? He says God will provide a lamb. Now, maybe he doesn't know what's going to be provided. He just knows somehow God is going to come through. That could be, that's arguably so. Even so, you jump forward to the New Testament, and who is called a lamb on more than one occasion? Jesus, yeah. John 1:29, John the Baptist sees Jesus and says, the next day he saw Jesus coming toward him, and he said, Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The Apostle John in Revelation 13:8 writes and calls Jesus the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So if Abraham is saying God will provide a lamb and that lamb is Jesus, that's a true statement, yes.
What we're getting from this is he didn't have this direction that we have.
Right.
It's solely on faith and obedience that we should have the same thing. I mean,
Exactly.
We even have this that he didn't have. He had no reference.
He had no reference.
That's what he was told to do.
Now, it is true that God does refer to Abraham as a prophet, and it is true that the patriarchs, the heads of families, kind of had a priestly role at this time, and Jesus says, and this is kind of intriguing, Jesus says in John 8:56, he's talking to the apostles, the Pharisees, and he says, Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. So what kind of foresight does Abraham have of Jesus? We don't really know. We do know that God promised to bless the world through his seed, and later on, Paul will clarify seed, not seeds, and that's a reference to Jesus. So Jesus is in the picture here already. He's part of the plan. But you're right. He doesn't have the written word to go on like we do, and yet you still see remarkable faith in Abraham. Verse 9. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, and that would have taken some time, stacking up all these rocks, and he laid the wood in order, and then, notice what he did. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, we can't, yes?
He didn't have to fight him. He didn't have to wrestle with him.
Right.
He just laid down and was bound.
Exactly, and this is intriguing. Now, of course, was there one to be a fly on a rock there to see this firsthand? Was there a struggle that is just not recorded? We don't know, but it sounds like there was not. It seems that there was not a struggle. And what does that tell us?
We'll put it in context with Jesus before they put him on the cross. He didn't open his mouth. He took what they had to give him, and he didn't utter a word.
Exactly.
And we can relate that back, to Isaac, comparing him to the sacrifice that Jesus did.
Yeah, exactly. You see, from all appearances here, it seems that we see a great deal of submission to the will of his father in Isaac, which again, if you go to the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew 26, verse 39, going a little further, he fell on his face and he prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." So Jesus could have called the whole deal off. He could have called down legions of angels to prevent this, but he submitted to the will of his Father, and from all appearances, you see that same submission in Isaac. And so again, a foreshadowing of Jesus. But here's something else that I think can be taken from this, and it's something about the kind of faith that Abraham has. It's been said, and I think it's quite true, your children's faith will not go deeper than yours. If your religion is just a surface show, your kids' religion is just going to be a surface show, and they'll probably not hold to that as they go along, because what's the point? It's just a facade. But I think what you see here is as Abraham raises his son, there are probably a number of instances where Isaac observed his father as being the real deal, as having remarkable faith. And I think you see that faith rubbing off on Isaac here. All right. So, verse 10. Then Abraham reached out his hand, and he took the knife to slaughter his son. But somebody called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand..." Who's the one who called? The who? The angel of the Lord. Yeah, not just an angel and not the Lord, but the angel of the Lord, who is a remarkable figure, a fascinating figure, who will appear on a number of occasions in the Old Testament. And then when you get to the New Testament, never hear his name mentioned again. But you do, but we'll go on. All right. And again, Abraham said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Notice that. Who originally is calling God to sacrifice his son? God. And now the angel of the Lord says, I see that you're not going to withhold this offering from me. Now again, the angel of the Lord appears on a number of occasions in the Old Testament, and he generally he speaks in the first person for God. In Exodus chapter 3, when the voice speaks from the burning bush, he's first referred to as the angel of the Lord. He's later referred to as God. And on another occasion, in the book of Judges, when the angel of the Lord appears to Manoah, the father of Samson. And again, he's referred to interchangeably as the Lord, and he even accepts worship and accepts sacrifice that's offered to him. Whereas in other instances, other angels, like when Daniel would try to worship an angel, or the Apostle John, they would say, don't worship me. But so there's an intriguing idea here that the angel of the Lord, who appears on a number of occasions in the Old Testament, is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, of God in human form. And when Abraham's talking to the Pharisees about Abraham, and the Pharisees say, how could you know anything about Abraham? You're not even... What did I say? When Jesus, I do that and she keeps me straight. All right. When Jesus is talking to the Pharisees about Abraham, and they say, how could you know anything about Abraham? You're not yet 50 years old. What does Jesus say? He says, before Abraham was, I am. He's pre-existent. He's been there all along, and I think we see him in the picture here. And the reason you don't hear the angel of the Lord mentioned in the New Testament is because the same character is there, but he's now being referred to as Jesus, as the Christ. All right. So, Abraham says, the angel of the Lord says, Abraham, Abraham. He expresses urgency, and in verse 13, Abraham lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and behold, behind him was caught in a thicket by his horns. A ram, rather, was caught in a thicket by his horns, and Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Yes, so Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. All right, now notice this is pretty fascinating here. Moses refers to the place of this offering as the mount of the Lord. If you jump forward to Isaiah, as Isaiah is discussing in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3, as Isaiah is discussing the temple and the location of the temple, Mount Zion, it's also referred to as the mountain, not the mount, but the mountain of the Lord. And so there's all this connectivity. It seems like this mount of the Lord is the future location of the temple in Jerusalem. And the angel of the Lord, verse 15, and the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now, a number of things here. Notice he's saying, in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Paul in Galatians will later identify that offspring, not offspring, not plural, but singular. That offspring is a reference to Jesus, according to Paul. Now, here's the other thing here. If you go back to Genesis 15:6, God accounts Abraham as righteous because of his faith. Here, notice what God says. And the angel of the Lord, Genesis 15:6, Abraham is accounted righteous because of his faith. Here, God says, you will be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. And so we see clearly, faith goes hand in hand with obedience for it to be the faith that pleases God. And that's exactly what James says in our final passage. James 2, and all these great Old Testament commentaries in the New Testament. James 2, verse 19, James says, you believe that God is one, you do well, even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. And you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. A simple mental assent to the existence of God, the demons have that, but they're not living in obedience to God. Yes?
Faith brings you to obedience.
Exactly.
If you have faith and then in the Lord, and the Lord tells you to be baptized for the remission of your sins, faith brings you to that obedience.
Exactly. That's right. The kind of faith that completely trusts God, when you believe something to be true with all of your heart, your actions will reflect that belief.
And Isaac also, we kind of overlooked Isaac's faith.
Yes.
Isaac had faith in his father that everything was going to be okay.
Exactly.
But you mentioned that whenever Isaac, the reason he was that way, because he watched his father his whole life and had that example of faith.
Exactly.
His whole life.
Sure. So, as I said, now, we only have a minute or two here, but let me run down and give a bullet point list here of what it means to have this kind of faith that Abraham has. And this is not an exhaustive list, but maybe these are some useful insights. One, Abraham's faith led him to believe that God could do the impossible. No matter what circumstances said, Abraham saw God as being more powerful than his circumstances. Two, Abraham's faith caused him not to doubt God's promises. God said, I want you to offer your son as a sacrifice. Abraham isn't saying, oh, you broke your promise. He's saying, well, God is going to keep his promise. That must mean he's going to raise him from the dead. All right. Next of all, Abraham's faith led him to obey even when it was painful and difficult. It's easy to obey in areas where we agree with God, but when we get to the point where even though God's word doesn't make sense, we obey it anyway, then that's the kind of obedience that true faith leads us to. Abraham's faith led him to obey promptly. He did not delay. When he saw God's will, he set about it. And next of all, Abraham's faith was contagious. When you have that kind of life, then people around you, you're like a glowing fire. People want to get around it and warm up to it. And you see that faith in Abraham's son. And who else did that faith rub off on? But that's my summary of what it means from this passage to have faith like Abraham's. But let me open it to you in the moments that we have here. What else do you see from this passage? What does Abraham's example commend to us? How else can we follow his example?
You're saying, what?
Beg your pardon?
Yeah.
Yeah. Elaborate.
Ask questions, just do what was asked of you.
He didn't ask questions. He just obeyed. Yeah. And it's important, as I said, it's important to realize Abraham didn't have this faith. We don't see this in Abraham earlier. When God tells Abraham to go to the land of Canaan, there's a famine, and so where does he go? He goes to Egypt. Yeah.
Faith that we pull off of whenever our faith is weak. We have to look back in these scriptures as guidance to strengthen our faith. Whenever we're not feeling good or we're going through a problem or something, look at Isaiah, look at Abraham, and pull from that faith.
Yeah. So I'm going to give the lesson to you, and there's been really good feedback and input, and I appreciate it a great deal. But you're absolutely right. And doesn't the New Testament tells us that the Old Testament scriptures are given to us for our encouragement. So that's exactly correct. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Good lesson.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Appreciate it very much.
You're well versed in the Bible.
Thanks.
I got some degrees. Helping good. How you doing?
Thank you. Thank you.
They know each other?
Right? Yes.
I didn't even know he was.
We have two widows of priests.
Oh, I hope y'all
Okay.
Her and Maxine Anderson, her husband died.
always
within the
enjoy
last
to
year.
see
He
you.
was a lifetime preacher.
Well, I'll be.
Not here, but other places.
Yeah.
Mary, thank you.
Yes. Well, hello. How are you doing?
I'm just doing fine. What about you?
I'm doing just as good as I can be.
I'm just excited as I can be to see you.
Well, thank you. We're just proud to be here. We really are.
Oh, that's the oldest. I'm so glad
Are you a walker here
in
preaching? Because with the mic, you can.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Yeah, that'll be great. I can meander a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I just,
Sure.
I was gonna say we'll kill the pulpit mic and just go off of
Okay.
hotel.
Perfect.
You know.
Right. Sure.
I hope you live here. We can sure use you.
Well, thank you.
I love it.
Well, thank you. We love you.
This is such a treat.
Yes. Well, it is. That's just wonderful. It's small world. Small world.
How's your parents?
They're doing great. They're just sound as a pound back in Odessa. And, yeah.
Hello, I'm Chris Phillips. I had your little children this morning.
Okay.
They were very sweet.
Well, thank you.
Very good.
We think so. Thank you.
Enjoyed that.
Thank
My name is
you.
Kay McPherson.
Yes, Paul Burton. Paul Burton. Nice to meet you, Kay.
It is a church in Glen Road. Shall we
Good
scooch?
lesson.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoyed having class. You did a good job.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know it. She just can't wait.
I missed you earlier. I'm Lloyd Cudd,
Lloyd, it's nice to
to have
meet
you
you.
with us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
especially because of these.
Well,
I mean, you know, it's nice to have you, but
yeah, they kind of outshine us a little bit. We're kind of partial to them ourselves, really. Three. This is Nathaniel. You say hi, Mr. Lloyd?
hi, buddy. Good to meet you. Are you outnumbered here? Yeah, a little outnumbered, but you can make it all right. You and your dad. Good to have you.
Thanks. Good to be here. What do you know?
She said she moved
Could you
here
hold
in
this stuff?
February.
There was something I didn't believe in there. What was it? She said that only us can pray.
Like what how? What do you mean?
She said like other people can't. Aren't allowed. They don't have the privilege.
So we'll have to talk to Dad about it. We'll talk to Daddy then. Very nice to meet you, Crystal, Burton, Nathaniel. Oh, you sit something down so you can shake hands. Nathaniel and Shari.
I got Skittles, Daddy. I got Skittles.
You did.
It's so yummy.
Get some water.
Okay, go here. Sister, just a moment.
Good job.
Be careful.
Be careful. Skittles. Good.
Hello,
I'm Betty Smith.
Crystal Burton.
Glad to meet you and your sweet children.
Caleb and Shari and Nathaniel. Say thank you.
Thank you.
I like that.
He likes to look snappy.
Good. That takes pride in how he looks. We're glad you're here with us today.
Thank you very much. Nathaniel, I don't want a sucker sticking out of your mouth during worship, okay? Yes, sister.
Break it up. This is like a rubby oil. Can you make the sucker stick? I can make the sucker ball come off.
Okay. What did you, so what were y'all talking about in Bible class? Was this the lesson? It's okay, honey, it's okay. You set your Bible down on top of it. You were trying to be kind to people and shake hands, and that was a nice thing to do. But this is it?
And these lights on hangman. And put these with words.
I'm Lloyd Ward.
Crystal Burton.
Crystal?
Very nice to meet you, Lloyd.
And how are you?
Nathaniel and Shari. And this is Caleb.
Good looking kids, huh?
Thank you. They're good kids.
What ages are they?
He's 8, and Shari is 6, and Caleb is 4.
4, 6, and 8.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Nice little crew. Thank you very much.